as they were called, the three G's: gold, God, and glory. And so in many ways, Columbus embodies the conquistador mindset. He's the first, and a lot of that has to do with a literal geographic objective. He wants to get to the Indies, as they were known, the East Indies, and really the reason behind this is that the problem is that, in all honesty, Portugal has such a hammerlock on the African on the African trading routes, that sailing west for Spain seems to be a pretty cool idea. He does become enormously successful. He becomes wealthy. He does make a mistake. He doesn't, end up calling the area that he discovers a new land. And because he doesn't do that, he doesn't get the title of the country or the continents. And we'll talk about a little bit how that happened. But again, he was super Catholic, and the very first thing he claims the territory in is in the name of God and the righteous king and queen of Spain. So Columbus, most people remember that he made an initial voyage to, they think, San Salvador in the Bahamas. He is on the way away from Cuba when he shipwrecks. So he has to leave behind a crew and takes the next two ships back. They come back, and the whole crew has been killed. Of course, when he returns, he's got like dozens of warships and attack dogs. And his return in 1493 is with the intent to conquer. The reason it turns out that the crew that he left behind were killed is apparently they were sexually assaulting the women of Cuba, and that meant that they had to go from the native perspective, certainly. But nonetheless, when he comes back, he says, I can go about subjugating, I think is the word he uses, these people without really having to do anything. Now, I want to be really clear with you when we look at this document, because if you're reading it, there are a couple things to keep in mind. First, this book was published in 1992. So immediately your brain should be saying, well, that date sounds kind of similar. And so at the 500th anniversary of the landing, there was a whole cottage industry of Columbus biographers and Columbus writers. So you have lots of material written about Columbus in the 500th anniversary. But this one, the title alone really tells you what the author is thinking. And he calls it an American Holocaust. Now, keep in mind, the word Holocaust associated with Nazi Germany, and he's saying Columbus and the Conquest. So this is not meant to be a soft, look at Columbus. And it says, hey, Columbus was better, apart from his skills, which set him apart. So this author standard says, Columbus was a good sailor. Probably better than everybody else. We're not the things that he believed. In other words, he was probably pretty similar with those three G's to everybody else. But the intensity with which he believed in them and the determination. So in other words, Columbus, he didn't necessarily come up with all those ideas, but he was by far the most motivated to carry them out. And it says he was an especially active embodiment of the European, and then it goes even further, the Mediterranean mind and soul of his time. So who is this Mediterranean mind and soul that the author is referencing? And the answer is the countries in Europe that were Catholic that bordered the Mediterranean Sea. So you think Spain, Portugal, France, Italy. So these were very, very, as he called them, religious fanatics. Keep in mind that the late 1490s and the early 1500s would be a tumultuous period in religion in Europe, the Reformation. And so they're saying these are Catholics who were fanatics. That's a strong word. Obsessed, again, so fanatic, obsessed with the conversion, conquest, or liquidation. So that's really an extraordinarily strong statement of all non-Christians. So he's saying that Columbus set out to, in essence, liquidate the population if they didn't become Catholic. And so then he says they're a crusader in search of wealth and fame who expected this mysterious world to be filled with monstrous races and golden people. So he takes a sort of almost supernatural quality to it. But often overlooked in the discussion of Columbus is this sort of religious intensity. Okay. So nonetheless, when Columbus got here, it's not the fact, particularly for me, that Columbus is the person you need to know. There's a lot of mystery shrouded in his history, but it's the impact of Columbus. So why I study and teach Columbus so much is not necessarily the guy, the person, but what impact did he have on the world? And he really did. He was, like I said, epochal in terms of his discovery. So coming out of the Americas was the greatest single accumulation of wealth since the days of Mansa Musa, the great king of Mali. Enormous sums of gold and silver were extracted from South America and the Caribbean, and it brought so much money back to Europe that capitalism was able to emerge. Without the bullion, the gold and silver of the New World, you don't have the availability of money. Money is just, it's too rare. And so this becomes known as the price revolution in Europe. And you see ultimately Spain will have dramatic inflation to the point where it cripples them. But initially, this will be a great benefit to the Spanish. Second, and by far in terms of human life, the most significant is the Columbian Exchange. And this is a new word. It's only about 40 years old. It was written by a historian named Alfred Crosby. And he said that, look, all of this amazing stuff going from the old world to the new and the new world to the old revolutionized, transformed dramatically humans in terms of the food we eat and the diseases we're exposed to and the livestock that we interact with. And I'll show you more of this in a minute. And then I think perhaps most significant for the Native Americans, and certainly living in a period where an epidemic is realistic, the diseases brought from Europe are absolutely staggering. It is expected that as many as 90% of the Native American population died as a result of European diseases. Now, I would point out that, this is not, they did not bring these diseases over as germ warfare. They didn't say, oh, let's carry smallpox and throw it amongst the natives. But they did see it as a blessing from God when the Native Americans died in masses to these plagues, yellow fever and smallpox particularly. Natives did give a gift that keeps on giving. They said, okay, Europeans, you're going to rape us so much, we'll have syphilis. So syphilis came from the Americas and still exists to this day, and it spread throughout Europe. So definitely know these characteristics. And then lastly, not that Columbus started this, but it utterly transformed when the Spanish began using the transatlantic slave trade. And that means while the Portuguese began it, the Spanish greatly increased it. And then, of course, later on here, the English as well. So big impacts of these voyages. So I mentioned Alfred Crosby. Here he is. He's the writer in the 70s who said, there's this thing called the Columbian Exchange. And he lists a whole bunch of them. And I think it's absolutely fascinating because one historian has kind of figured out why so many people ended up looking like that. He has a theory about this because what the natives didn't do is domesticate animals. So if you read in here, it says the old world is Europe. So Europe had wheat. That's how the staple diet of a European was bread, barley, and rice from Africa. So this, if you're a European kind of like lower class peasant person, these things were your meal. Very little meat, very little good stuff. So wheat, barley, rice had not traveled to America, but the Americans had corn and potatoes. So try to imagine these folks' life in Europe without corn and potatoes. It really sounds absolutely awful. Manioc's another type of melon or tuber. In the Americas, there were no horses, cattle, sheep, or goats. So let's talk about this for a minute. One of the reasons why Native Americans, it's believed, died en masse like this is because they didn't have livestock. And if you know anything about how we contract viruses, they usually come from animals. We know more than likely that the COVID-19 is a result of bat droppings in open markets landing on other food. So bats carried it, and it ends up in humans. And if you know much about virology, once it jumps from an animal to a person, it usually takes on really, really tough, devastating symptoms. So it seems that the Europeans, having spent centuries facing epidemics, dying from the plague, dying from these diseases, had developed, for lack of a better phrase, herd immunity. But the Native Americans didn't have this immunity at all. And so if you think of the smallpox and the influenza that the Europeans had, it had been evolving to try to overcome the herd immunity of the Europeans. And now it hit people who had no immunity to it at all, and it wiped them out, just absolutely devastated them. And they themselves thought it was a curse from God. Now, another thing that made Native Americans, well, for lack of a better word, healthy is they bathed. they took baths, and the Europeans didn't. And so again, Europeans were filthy. Natives could talk about smelling them before they saw them. A third theory goes to that Bering Land Bridge. You may remember the land bridge. There is one theory that Native Americans, as they traveled through the land bridge in the frozen times of the Ice Age, the viruses and germs that they were carrying died. And then lastly, with the exception of a handful of places like Cahokia or Tenochtitlan, most Native American communities were very densely populated, light population density. So what this means is you throw all that together, low population density, sort of a frozen chamber for getting rid of bugs, this lack of exposure to these diseases because they didn't have domesticated animals, and hygiene meant that the natives were fairly clean and healthy people until they encountered European nastiness. And again, this is not meant to be an overt criticism of Europeans. It's just the different cultures they had. And so these pathogens, that's the word for viral agents, associated with the old world's dense population. So again, in England, in France, in Holland, in Italy, they had city-states. And then, of course, the animals that carried the virus, including the rats and the mosquito. And so you had a really terrible impact as a result of this. So let's go and look at a couple other historians. And again, this idea of the Columbian Exchange is probably the biggest takeaway from this chapter. It's number one topic. And it says the world literally changed before the Indian eyes. The Europeans came and they just a minute, student mentioned terraforming, and that's what they did. Europeans cut down the trees and planted, rows, and then they brought over livestock, and basically the culture of these people is that they had to adapt. They had to adapt. So the Pueblo and the Navajo transformed their lives. They literally changed the way they lived, and of course, other things influenced the Americans as well. So try to make sense out of this. The idea of domesticating animals was a European development. All of these animals came here. The idea of growing crops like this on a larger scale. And so do know the types of goods exchanged. So as you see here, there's some cash crops, lots of produce, tons of produce. You see other goods coming across here. And the Columbian Exchange is going to change the diet of all of these continents. So what's ironic and really unexpected is even with the millions of Africans who were kidnapped during this and taken into slavery, the African population grows. The European population grows, even with migration to the Americas. And it's because of this Columbian Exchange impact on the food supply. The food supply is massively expanded, and it's as you probably remember the food pyramid, it's a much more well-balanced diet. So the Columbian Exchange had a very positive influence on the European, with the exception of maybe syphilis, and a much more detrimental, obviously devastating impact on natives and lesser degree African. So make sure that you know that the population really grew and people could live longer because they ate better food, except if they were Native American, of course. And so this is smallpox. This is what it looks like. And like other viruses, normally what kills you is fever, or diarrhea. This is really people just going to the bathroom until they die. It's just an awful thing. And so they died in numbers. Now, this is something that you are going to have to do throughout this course, and it is the idea of connecting the dots, so to speak. So here is a picture, if you want to call it that, a woodcut, and it depicts Native Americans laying down and giving up because what has happened to them is they have been exposed to smallpox, and their will to live has been absolutely just decimated. And Native Americans killed themselves in large numbers. They threw themselves off cliffs, or they died by the millions from these plagues. So the question is, what's going on down here to connect with that? And to tell you a little bit about it, that bottom picture is an event in American history called the Trail of Tears. And it was the forced relocation of Native Americans from east of the Mississippi, the Seminole and others, to Oklahoma. And if you've been following the news lately, you may have just seen that the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that half of Oklahoma is now going to be returned to Native Americans. So that's kind of an interesting about face. But what it means is that when white people, use that term historically, when Europeans or United States people moved into areas, what had to happen to the natives, at least by their mindset? Well, they had to go. And so this is the forced relocation. Here is the exposure. Either way, you've been exposed to Europeans or their descendants, and you're either dead or gone. And that was the fate of Native Americans. And one historian's called Saul, his name was Saul Tax, called our Native American history our original sin. You know, the first thing that America really did wrong. Obviously, nothing that you need to feel guilty about. Something that happened 500 years ago. But, you know, it's something that we're still dealing with. Like I said, you know, the Supreme Court just ruled on it. So anyway, the Spanish comes in here, and this is where the Spanish territory was. If you see the blue here, all of this blue was Spanish. So, you know, this is the height of the family of Habsburgs that ruled in Spain and in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Their cousins ruled in Austria. And at one point, King Charles V ruled all of that. And so this is just a massive territory. And so when they come in, they're like, well, we're gonna get the business settling it. We're gonna take it over. And so, you know, we think about Columbus's voyage, but we forget that he was also governor of Cuba. And so when he's here, he creates a term that you should know, and it is encomienda. Make sure you have that term defined. And the encomienda system, it's a translation to entrusted. So the Catholic Church said you could not make slaves out of people. Okay, so it could make slaves out of people who were Christians. So you had a responsibility to turn them into Christians. But in exchange for you turning them into Christians, you got to use them as labor. So you're not going to call them slaves, you're going to call them encomenderos. And so what happened was to encourage Spaniards to migrate to America, which there weren't that many Spanish people. They did this. The conquistadors became encomenderos, and they were granted large estates, large, vast amounts of land, and they were allowed to have all the Native Americans who lived on that land as their workers. And so you can imagine that was shocking to the workers to hear that, to the natives. I always would equate this to, let's say I walk into one of your houses one day and say, oh, I live here now and you work for me. You know, but that's kind of what happened. And in reality, that was, you know, not something that proved to be very Christianized. It was more like sort of, you know, giving lip service to being Christians. So the question I like to ask students is a lot of times is, why do we celebrate Columbus Day? You know, what's the deal? So what's interesting to me about Columbus Day is this part right here. Now, early on, you know, 300th anniversary, there was a Columbus Day celebration in New York and Massachusetts. You know, they were like, yay, Columbus, America. But in the anniversary of the 400th, you have a very political reason for Columbus Day. So if you don't know anything about late 19th century America, a lot of, quote, Native Americans, and by that I mean white third and fourth generation Americans, despised immigrants. This was a period of nativism, and they particularly hated the new immigrants that came from Italy. And so down in New Orleans, a group of New Orleans people murdered a group of Italians, just slaughtered them in a mob. And President Harrison, who's pretty forgettable, was concerned that there would be large-scale violence against Italians and also demands of Italian Americans to use force to stop them. So you have a sort of cultural conflict going on in America 400 years after Columbus between whites and Italians, who are also whites. But, you know, students sometimes don't realize the ethnic history of our country has been in conflict, almost all of it. So after that, you know, they decided that we needed to step up our patriotism as a country. And so for the first time, really, schools began to teach what it meant to be loyal to the United States of America. And this is when you had, drafted by a socialist, no less, the Pledge of Allegiance, which is something we still do. And so during this period, you know, the idea was that this was a way to celebrate the heritage of immigrants to this country who were really not popular by the, you know, quote, non-immigrant background. And so after that, you have a group called the Knights of Columbus. They're a Catholic order, and they pushed very hard to have a national holiday to celebrate the greatest Italian American, even though technically Columbus was not an Italian American. He's probably the most famous Italian in history. Therefore, he should be celebrated, they argue. So you have some very, and keep in mind, Italians in the 1930s, key voting group, particularly in New York State, influencing President Roosevelt. And so ultimately, we have a national holiday to celebrate this guy who, if you didn't do what you were supposed to, it was legal to chop off the hands of workers. So it's kind of the thing where you're like, what kind of guy is this again? He would kill people and chop off their hands. Yet nonetheless, that's where we are today. Now, keep in mind, people are going to say, well, then why celebrate anybody else? And that's a fair argument. And we can talk about anybody who wants to be celebrated, people who support it. But I do wonder why this guy is the one currently after all these years. Now, it certainly made sense at the time to placate Italian voters, but that's kind of not the country we live in anymore. So tomorrow we're going to take up the subject of, to me, one of the great heroes of the period, of the European side, and this is the guy who fought against the conquest. This is the priest who said what we're doing as a people is wrong, and his name is Bartolome de las Casas, and he's probably my favorite European out of this set. So that's where we'll stop with today, and I will